Welcome back to the show, folks. It is the month of April. It is spring. How exciting. Today, we're honing in on the brain, and my guest is a repeat guest. He's become a good friend, and I think you guys are going to love this episode. But before we jump in, of course, I want to thank you for being here. And if you haven't already signed up for my newsletter, I would love to invite you to do so, because if you sign up for my newsletter, you get an 8-part series on longevity foundations. So basically, it's setting the foundation for more advanced biohacking. So if nothing else, it's kind of like a mini book, but it's delivered to you over 8 or 12 weeks. I mean, we do it over time because these are pretty meaty emails. So if you haven't done that, you might want to think about it. Also, if you're a peptide enthusiast, then you might want to sign up also for the peptide newsletter, which is a separate newsletter. We don't send out as many newsletters on that one, but it is very much more focused on peptides. Finally, thirdly, if you want to hang out with me, and if you would like to meet some of the guests that we have on the podcast to ask your very own questions live, then you might want to think about joining my community, my membership community. And you're going to find information about all these things at natnidham.com. That's my website. There's a tab at the part called the community. Actually, there's a pop-up that invites you to join the community, and there's a tab at the top for joining the newsletter. All right. Last but not least, if you're feeling inspired today, make sure that you leave us a review on whatever platform you're listening to the podcast on, because that is ultimately how we get to reach more fabulous people just like you. Today's guest, Dr. Gregory Kelly, has spent years studying how to help people think faster, age better, and avoid that 3 p.m. crash that turns you into a zombie. He's an expert in nootropics, cognitive health, and the power of sleep. We're chatting about the best ways to keep your brain firing on all cylinders without relying on an endless stream of coffee. If you've ever wished for an extra gear in your mental engine, this is the episode for you. As a matter of fact, I'm running on Qualia Mind myself right now. I do so pretty much 5 days a week, most weeks. Now, if you're interested in giving it a try yourself, this Qualia Mind that I'm talking about and that we're going to dive deep into in this episode, you're going to visit qualialife.com/Natalie. Now, remember, Natalie has an H in it, NATHALIE, and use promo code Natalie, NATHALIE, to save 15% on your order. Hey folks, just a quick reminder that all of the information presented in this podcast is for information purposes only. No medical advice, no diagnosing, no treatments suggested here. Before you try anything that you hear about or learn about here, make sure that you check with your medical provider. Welcome to the show, Dr. Greg Kelly. It is a pleasure to have you here. Again, it's always so great to see you.
Oh, I always love joining you and talking to you, whether it's here in instances like this or at live events. I
don't think we've bumped into each other at a live event in a while. We're going to have to do a better job in 2025. So we're going to talk about today, we're talking about the brain. And the mind really is what we're talking about, which, is an interesting thing, right? Because people think about their brain. There's a distinction to be made between the organ and that greater entity that is the mind. Should we start there? Should we start on get a little philosophical on people?
I generally, have a sense that when people think about the brain, it's the idea of thinking, right, is what comes to mind, right? And thinking, to me and most neuroscientists, means some combination of, focusing our attention, learning, putting things in memory, retrieving them from memory. But thinking includes way more than that. It includes the way neuroscientists often would bucket it, at least in the health sense, is there's all these individual skills like, reaction times, focusing attention, managing our emotions, setting goals, having the willpower to do the good thing that helps us accomplish the goal versus something that may move us further away, right? So there's all of these skills or tasks, and neuroscientists generally, would put them in bigger buckets called cognitive domains. We can go into those a bit more, but those are, more, I think, closely mapped to what people think of as thinking, at least several of those. But then a huge part of what we think of the mind is, the analogy is often used like a top-down brain and a bottom-up emotions. And the top-down idea means that our conscious mind is only made aware of a little trickle of all the sensory experience that we're having both externally and internally. And there's something called the default mode network that's almost the filter between those. And then the bottom up idea is that we have all this raw sensory experience that we don't usually get to have direct access to. It's all filtered for us. And so when you start talking more about mind, it's that idea of, I think, more of consciousness, right? Like what we're consciously aware of. And the truth is the brain's doing all kinds of things behind the curtain, so to speak, that we're never aware of, that is super important to make it so all these important skills are things that we succeed at in life.
Yeah. And so, I mean, so it's a busy place. There's a lot going on.
Busy, yeah.
Whether you think you're thinking or not, you're thinking. And, whether we're at work or we're interacting with other people, we require, there's a huge energetic cost. And as a matter of fact, what is it? Like the brain consumes, is it 20% of our energy at any given moment?
Yeah, like that's generally the figure you would see, is that the brain's voracious when it comes to energy and consumes
an energy pig.
Yeah, 20%. And it's it's why proportionally we have a much bigger brain for our body size than other mammals, because it is doing all these high level cognitive things, and that requires a lot of energy. So for listeners, if you really don't retain anything else from this, like one is that when we're asking our brain to do harder things require more mental energy. And mental energy is, basically a synonym for physical energy. So if you were to put a bunch of people and image their brain and ask them to do cognitively demanding things, you would see a big change in the blood flow to the parts of the brain that are working harder. The blood flow is basically delivering glucose, since it's a primary fuel for the brain. And then the brain's going to churn through that really quickly as we're doing that cognitively demanding thing, and often then get exhausted. And when it gets exhausted, the higher level things, which I think of as skills like empathy or accomplishing goals, are the first things sacrificed.
Yes, and now you just go into, I guess it's moving into the survival brain, like what's going to keep us alive and help us to find more fuel to do the next thing, kind of thing.
Yeah, it's almost, I guess the easiest way for me to think about it is when the brain's starting to run out of energy, anything that's using a lot of resources is the first things that are shut down, right? So, and those are just, I often will use the idea of a cognitive pyramid, and I mentioned the cognitive domains, but the foundation, I think, for any, daytime things is being awake and alert, obviously. So that's the foundation. If we don't have that, if we're struggling with fatigue, then it's hard, for our brain to do anything higher up the pyramid. But the next level up is what neuroscientists would call cognitive attention. So for listeners, you can think of that as our focus, and our ability to put our focus where we want for however long we want. And it also would encompass things like reaction speeds. So that's the reason I use that as the next level up, is getting higher up always requires attention. Like we can't learn without attention. We can't have empathy unless we're focusing our attention on who we're interacting with. And then higher up the pyramid, you have what I think of as the more energy demanding skills, and the first one's sacrificed when our brain's running out of energy or resources. And that's executive function would be one big group. And just think, for listeners, that's all the different skills that might be called on to be a successful entrepreneur or executive, right? It's the goal settings, it's working memory, it's changing our mind when new information comes in. That's something called cognitive flexibility. And so a suite of those types of things. And then we also have something called social cognition, which is on my pyramid high up. Maybe for most people, the top, the first thing to go.
And that's the first thing to go.
And that's managing our emotions and putting ourselves in others' shoes and practicing empathy. And the reason I say that's often the first thing to go is because those tend to be energetically demanding things for many people. Not everyone. Some people are just, that's a really strong muscle, but a lot of people it isn't. And so, I often tell a story of my dad, who was a busy executive. I grew up in the Boston area. He had a crazy commute. I wouldn't wish it on anyone. And then, I know he started his day with a cup of black coffee, and as he left the door, didn't eat. And I just recall as a kid, my dad would come home, say 6:30 after a long day, brutal commutes both ways, and would be that, maybe archetype of the irritable, grouchy dad. At least this, for listeners, this was late 60s, early 70s, like that. My dad was that person that would, maybe have a martini or go down and clean his pipes or polish his shoes, like do something almost that didn't require much mental energy. And then a half hour later, 40 minutes later, we'd have like a nicer version of our dad. And I know it was a tough situation for my siblings and I to grow up in because it was unpredictable. And generally speaking, humans don't do great when there's unpredictability.
Yeah.
And it's, for listeners, my story about my dad cuts him a lot of slack, because I don't think I would be able to have performed any better coming home after that day than he did. And it's the same what you'll see sometimes in your spouses or significant others, right? That they kind of leave the best version of themselves at the office. And when they first walk in the door, they just need time to replenish their mental energy before they can then be the better version. So, I try to be gracious the more I've understood mental energy, that if I see someone that, at least in my judgment, maybe not be showing up as their best self in the moment, then, the story I try to default to is they might do better if they took Qualia Mind or something else that would have given
give them a snack,
more resources to get through this. So.
Yeah, no, that's really interesting. And actually, I think we can see this play out in small children.
Absolutely.
Right? Like on a microscopic level, I mean, little people who, when they're exhausted, you can just see the disassembling of any capacity they might have had to share or be nice or be able to control themselves. You have like this weeping little heap of humanity kind of on the floor, unable to process or control themselves. And I think that's very often when they've just completely run out of fuel.
Yeah, I think kids are a great example there because they're so unfiltered, right? When they're feeling it, they're showing it often. So
yeah. So definitely, so mental energy is that thing, because people talk about energy all the time. I don't have enough energy for this or enough energy for that, and I think we make the mistake of not distinguishing between kind of mental energy and physical energy.
Yeah.
Right? Like there's a difference there. You can be physically, and I think that might be in that hierarchy as well. Like the body is going to keep the body moving because from a survival perspective, you have to keep moving, and you have to just keep enough of the brain awake so that you can be vigilant for danger.
Yeah.
And to your point, that the higher functions kind of disappear, but we recognize when there's really bad expressions, right? Like I'm brain dead, or my brain is mush, or I can't function anymore. Like as an adult, you start to recognize these things. And then the brain is smart, right? The brain says, I know what's going to give me energy. You see that big bowl of jelly beans over there?
Absolutely.
That's energy.
Yeah. Glucose is the preferred fuel of the brain. Now, we could get into ketones and other things, right?
Let's do it. Like, let's talk about some of the different energy systems in the brain and why some are better than others. Because there's a story that says that ketones fuel the brain, but I think ketones enable the brain to use other stores of glycogen or glucose for fuel. And the ketones do something else. Like, I think there's a lot of confusion around that.
Yeah. So even when someone goes into ketosis, intentionally typically, right? So there's higher amounts of ketones in circulation and hence arriving at the brain for fuel. There's still plenty of blood glucose under those circumstances, right? Because we need some. The brain never would run exclusively on ketones. Some people, and often it's because of age or health reasons, will perform cognitively a lot better with ketones. The healthiest brains are metabolically flexible, and they're usually great on either source of fuel, and typically run the best when we give them opportunities to access both types of fuel intermittently. So I think glucose tends to often get vilified, and our brain really, can't perform at its best without glucose. In fact, there's studies in young children, teenagers, adults, all kinds of studies, especially with the combination of caffeine and glucose. And caffeine, by far, is the most studied nootropic compound, and by far, I would say 3 or 4 times more studies than anything else I'm aware of.
It's
and
crazy.
Caffeine without a source of fuel, which could be like Dave's coffee recipe that he made.
Don't say that. Don't say the B word. Fatty coffee.
My awareness. Danger coffee now, I think is. That's a source of fuel. Glucose can be a source of fuel, but caffeine without some source of fuel, what would normally show up in studies quickly is people would still be alert, but their irritability and anxiousness and those things go up when you don't have fuel. And I think it's because caffeine. And for really knowledgeable people about cars, this isn't a perfect analogy, but it's directionally right. Think of caffeine almost like turbo. It's causing our brain to run through a lot more resources to perform at a higher level temporarily. But if we didn't get more of those resources, and fuel is one of them, then we run out and we get into exactly what you and I were talking about, right? The things that occur when we're running short of energy. So, I've seen it, going back to when I was in the Navy, and a lot of people drank a lot of black coffee and then thought because they were awake and alert, they were performing at a high level. And it was an LOL. They were not. So
they were awake.
Grouchy, hard people to be around. So for many of the things with the brain, like just understanding that energy story, I think is really important. And then cutting ourselves slack, if we're not performing our best, like I know if I'm like super hungry, then I'm going to be a little more challenged managing my emotions than I might normally be. Not as an excuse to behave poorly, but to be more aware of, so that I don't blame someone else for what's actually going on inside of me.
Well, it's that whole hangry thing, right? But in a metabolically flexible person, they may be better resourced to manage the sugar lows. So glucose and caffeine, have been, you've got a number of products out there that have been created to basically give the brain a boost and give this big boost. But the challenge, I think, that a lot of people experience is it might work, and then all of a sudden it doesn't. And it's like you're flying at 10,000 feet and your parachute springs a leak and down you come crashing to earth. Yeah. And that is a roller coaster ride that I think a lot of people ride on a day-to-day basis. And that's where I think this whole area of nootropics has emerged over the last number of years, which is a different way. I mean, it must tap into some of the same systems, but it's kind of like almost a different way of looking at how we can help the brain or the mind to be better resourced and not pay the price on the other end of it. And I mean, I've told this story a couple of times. There used to be a nootropic formula that I would use, and I loved it because I got so much done. But then by 2:00 in the afternoon, I literally turned into the Wicked Witch of the West. Like it was so shocking that I realized it. Yeah. like I could tell, oh my goodness, like I'm nasty. And it took me a while to put 2 and 2 together and realize that every time I took X, it was important for me to be by myself by 2.
Well, and it's one of the, one of the truisms with nootropic stacks or even individual nootropic ingredients has always been that your mileage may vary. Meaning that, how I respond to something may be different than you respond, it may be different than a listener. So it's always important to pay attention to how we're responding. But I think your mileage may vary also applies to contexts like yours, that, like out of the gate for the first couple hours I was rocking, but then oh my God, I was horrible to be around. Like this stack isn't probably the best one for me. So it's just always important with any, nootropics to do that, and often to ask people that will actually give us honest feedback, because I know one of the things we've seen many times over the years is customers on Qualia Mind and their spouse, reordering it for them, because when they've gone off, they're like, "Oh, I want that version of them."
So much nicer.
Yeah. So that's important, and it's why I told that story of my dad, because I know for me, it's important when people take Qualia Mind that they experience what we designed it for, right? So a sense of motivation, more focus, over time, better memory. And I don't want them to turn into an unbearable person to be around. I want them to walk in the door at the end of their day and still have enough resources left in the tank to be the best version of themselves for whatever home is for them.
Yeah, 100%. So let's talk a little bit about nootropics, because there are you Google nootropics and your computer is going to explode kind of thing. And so, as you mentioned, like caffeine is one of the best researched nootropic substances. But there are so many others. You've got things like lion's mane, or like there's a ton of different nootropics. How do we draw it, and should we even draw a line between what's nootropic, what's just a brain nutrient, or like, is there something specific that makes a nootropic? And what does it even mean? What does nootropic mean?
Like, historically, the idea of nootropics dates to a Romanian chemist that was actually trying to create something for insomnia, for sleep, and so was working on something he thought would impact the GABA system, which is the brain's braking system, and created a compound called piracetam, which was the first of a category of what listeners can think of them as research chemicals, because they're not dietary supplements and they're not approved drugs in the US. But that category, when he gave them to animals, the animals behaved in a smarter way. They, would solve a maze better. They would remember it better. And what he really used the idea of nootropics to mean, because he coined the term, literally it had to do with mind bending. But neuroplasticity would be the best way in our current language to think about it. Compounds that allowed the learn to learn better, remember more, ultimately behave better in a variety of settings. So I think the other important distinction he made is that they should be non-harmful. Because there was, compounds that might improve, some aspect of cognitive performance, but at a pretty steep cost over time. So that's, at least at Qualia, how we used that term. Like, in general, helping the brain think better, manage emotions better, and in a way that really upgrades the brain's performance in multiple areas.
Yeah.
And a lot of that then has to do with the idea of resources that you've touched on a few times, right? Like supplying the brain, the essential things it needs more of if we're asking it to do more thinking and more managing of our emotions.
Right.
Go ahead.
No, sorry. I was going to say, there's more than fuel that comes into play here. There's this whole area of neurotransmitters and supporting and I think what was happening to me is I was so depleted in certain nutrients that I was just like, my neurotransmitters were completely out of whack by the end. I had nothing. I had no feel good neurotransmitters left. Like there was no dopamine or serotonin to be seen for miles, kind of thing. Maybe could we talk, maybe make that distinction, because I think that's where we move. Because if you think about not nicotine, what we were just talking about, caffeine. Maybe I need a little fuel. Caffeine plus sugar. That's a pretty simple thing. You could say that's almost like a nootropic. You've got your fuel source, you've got your caffeine, that's going to be your turbo. Great. But it's leaving a lot undone at the same time. And there's a metabolic cost in the brain at the end of the day. So there are more sophisticated stacks when we move into this more sophisticated nootropic world, which is going to maybe come with a whole entourage. Because, Qualia Mind, there's no sugar in Qualia Mind.
Correct.
Last time I checked.
But lots of resources.
Exactly. So anyway, just letting you go along the resource road here.
I think a good way to maybe tie into that is, again, getting back to that idea of mental energy, which is more than just ATP, right? It's mitochondria, and it's that, so Qualia Mind has ingredients like acetylcarnitine and PQQ that are very much mitochondrial nutrients for, doing things to make it so that we can burn any fuel more efficiently. But when I think of like, all right, what does the brain use all of this energy for, right? Because you've said it's voracious, and a huge amounts are sensory, right? Fueling our hearing and our vision. And hearing, as an example, if anything, more resources are allocated to that when we sleep than even during waking, because that's our main way to tell the environment's still safe through the night. Right? So senses never sleep and demand a lot of energy. And then another big use of that energy is the neurotransmission, right? So making, releasing, recycling these neurotransmitters and over and again requires a lot of energy. So neurotransmission is a big, both energy and resource hub. And for things like, as an example, the building block for dopamine. I'm sure listeners will have heard of dopamine. And dopamine is often tied to reward, but it's also all about motivation. The general idea, and I like Lisa Feldman Barrett. She was the author of How Emotions Were Made and 7.5, I think, Secrets About the Brain, or 7.5 Things About the Brain. But she tends to use the idea of the main job of the brain is balancing our body budget. And what she means by that is all of our resources. And at any moment in time, the brain is making a decision. Is it wise to invest them here or not? Or should maybe I conserve them for something else or put them into this instead? And so resources end up just being super important. They're like the basis for how, at the end of the day, our brain's making decisions. And if there's more available, then there's, more capacity to do things. And dopamine, in a way, is a compound that would signal, oh, because of something we did in the past that I've now tagged with this dopamine, I think this is going to be worth the investment we make in it. It's likely to give me a reward, in a sense, right? But the brain's always predicting. So what would happen for, like as an example, there was a study at one point, and it was a military study, and I think it might have been like a search and rescue type of thing for pilots. But, in the instant that pilots might be captured, they want to give them an experience of what an interrogation might be like, which is pretty horrible, right? Like clearly stressful. And in that, like, you would use up a lot of the neurotransmitters that have to do with dopamine, because obviously not very rewarding, but like there's a lot, you have to stay motivated and try to like push back against this. And what they found in that study is if they gave high amounts of L-tyrosine, which is the building block to make dopamine, that they were able to resist the interrogation a lot longer. But what resistance looked like was actually being more argumentative and more like being able to just stay in that state resisting that instead of breaking down, right? So when we run out of any particular building block for a neurotransmitter, then that system tends to weaken or outright fail. And so, like for acetylcholine, which is another really important neurotransmission system, the building block is both acetyl groups and choline. Acetyl groups could come from something like acetylcarnitine. Choline can come from nootropic sources like alpha-GPC or acetylcholine that are both great brain sources. And acetylcholine becomes crazy important for both attention, but also for memory. And so the story that I like about acetylcholine is that's what our brain releases to, like, for neuroplasticity, to change the brain's landscape. And it's almost like the brain says, oh, this is really relevant. This is something that is worth remembering. Let me secrete more acetylcholine so that we can make sure we remember this. So we need enough of the molecules to do that if we're going to do that. And I'm sure you've heard of the 10,000 hours, something, I believe Malcolm Gladwell popularized it. But for the 10,000 hours to work, which that's not a magic number, it could be way less, it could be way more. And what makes it way more or way less is the ability to focus attention. If we're just zoning out, 10,000 hours isn't going to get us much mastery. But if we're really highly focused, it would, which is why, one of the reasons we created Qualia Mind was focus. But then the other piece is without acetylcholine, even if we were focused, that 10,000 hours would have been largely wasted. That's why the cholinergic system becomes something that's compromised often with aging, and we start to see challenges with learning and memory in people as they get older.
Oh, that's really interesting. So that whole system goes down. That's so interesting. So you bring up a good. So you've talked about L-tyrosine. Then there's acetyl groups. Then there's choline. So we're now moving into this world of brings us to the point of discussion of stacking. Right. So we could, like we said before, we could take caffeine and sugar and probably get a burst of energy, manage for a period of time, and then crash. But if we were maybe paying a bit more attention, we might start to put together different building blocks that creates more of a balanced approach to fueling what we want, right? So this whole idea of stacking different compounds, either that are nootropics themselves or that just support the production of those compounds in the brain that we need to do the job.
Well, and it's why, I think of Qualia Mind as that whole cognitive pyramid approach. So going back to that pyramid idea, caffeine rocks for the base of the pyramid. Like alertness would be the word, or vigilance you would see used a lot. It's also really good for some parts of complex attention, meaning, it within reason, and caffeine's a Goldilocks compound, meaning more is not better, within often a range of about, say, 50 to 200 milligram amount, attentional things improve. So reaction speeds, processing time, sometimes other areas of focus, but that becomes something that reliably typically is better when you stack theanine in it, because then you get what would often be described as a sense of calm focus or calm energy, instead of that more frantic energy that caffeine on its own can give. And
it's that matcha tea thing.
And caffeine would generally do pretty poorly at predictably doing anything useful above the complex attention. And often it makes managing our emotions worse if we just do it on its own, which is there's usually a 7-question caffeine scale that's used extensively in research, but it will ask things about anxiousness, irritability, as well as feelings of energy and alertness, right? Because the downsides often come with caffeine if we're not, if we rely on it too much without building it into a stack just to fill that nice basal role of the pyramid if we need it. And if we want to do these things higher up, then we need to find other things that are more suited for working memory or cognitive flexibility or social cognition. Like social cognition, saffron might be among the most important and well-studied things.
Okay, so that's a spice. So tell us about saffron and because there's saffron in, let's just be clear. If you guys have never bought Qualia Mind before and you buy Qualia Mind, you're in for a treat, because it's a lot of ingredients and you're going to sit there and go, well, what the heck? So we're not going to dive into all of them, but saffron's an interesting one to me because it's a spice. If you use too much of it, it tastes kind of chemically, but the right amount will make the most amazing rice dish or whatever it is. So, but tell us about this saffron in the brain.
So, one way I just sort things, and this is a simple system, is there's some things that, at least for the use that I'm thinking about them, that are overrated. There's some things that are properly rated. There's some things that are underrated. And by overrated, I mean, compared to what the science and studies would show, people's opinion of it is a lot better than might be justified.
Right.
Doesn't mean it's a bad thing. It's just a little bit maybe exaggerated.
Overplayed.
Properly rated would be people are generally in the right ballpark. And then underrated, it's if people knew what I knew about this, it would be way more used for this purpose. And saffron would be in that underrated category as a nootropic. It's usually thought of mostly for mood. So you'll, I think if, people went on in an AI and said, oh, like, what are most of the studies on saffron? You'd find things like depression and anxiety, like mood related areas. But saffron's really, I think, versatile, and especially that social cognition bucket I mentioned, which I just view as undernourished for many of us. Saffron's a superstar. It also, in studies just as a nootropic, tends to really work reliably well for things like attention and memory. It's a little slower than, like, caffeine's fast, obviously, right? If we're sleep deprived, we'll notice a difference,
Yeah.
quickly. Saffron's a slower nootropic, but a really, really useful one, and one that for listeners, we had a version of Qualia Mind that was the original one. That was a 7-capsule last September, so September 2024. We upgraded it, is how I would describe it, and released what internally I always refer to as Qualia Mind 2.0. And one of the upgrades was saffron. So,
what were the other upgrades? So tell me, because I remember having this conversation with Chase, who's someone that works with Greg, and the two of us lamenting, but we really like Qualia Mind. We don't want them to change it. And as it turns out, we both love the new Qualia Mind, so we're very happy. But what did you drop and what did you bring in? So you brought in the saffron, which was kind of like one of the unsung heroes in this whole kind of social cognition space. What else have you brought in that's kind of new, that was that was kind of like a little underdog?
Yeah, so lutein and zeaxanthin would also be, like, I think, a crazy underappreciated nootropic. And
those are powerful antioxidants, right?
Yeah. And they're usually thought of first and foremost for vision, because the back of the eye is called the retina, and it's what allows a lot of our visual functions to do with color, and not visual acuity per se, like passing an eye test, but almost every other job the visual system does, the retina is doing. And those are pigments that would be found in nature, and think of them almost as nature's blue blockers for the back of our eye. Right? They act almost as shade for it. And it also turns out they both concentrate in parts of our brain, especially the visual parts of our brain. So the interesting thing is, while they're, like if you went to a health food store, you're probably just going to see them in whatever the vision part of the
eye section. Yeah, for sure.
Yeah, is that there's about a dozen human studies on lutein and zeaxanthin for cognitive things. One as young as 5 to 12-year-olds, others, elderly people, others college students, and almost all of these studies have been really long studies, which is unusual for brain studies. A long study might be, 3 months, and some of the lutein zeaxanthin ones have lasted a year. Most have lasted at least 6 months, and it's slow acting, but consistently things like, so the brain's made up of networks. We talked about the default mode network earlier, but there's the attentional network, there's other networks. And part of high performance is those networks integrating well with each other. And in one study, lutein improved that integration of different networks. In many others, it's improved aspects of memory. In quite a few, it's made a huge impact on attentional things. So it's crazy underrated for how good it is for our brain. And more of one of the things with this new version of Qualia Mind I wanted to do was balance both the acute, so a day to 5-day impact of Qualia Mind, with giving a lot more nutrition for long-term brain health and long-term brain jobs. And I just think this new version of Qualia Mind is such an upgrade in that latter category without sacrificing at all the former.
Yeah. Well, I think that's always been one of my biggest cheers about Qualia Mind, and specifically, is that it helps you to build a better brain, which, most nootropics, they're just, and I mean, it's okay, but they're really focused on the right now. Like, how am I going to, what can I take right now to make me better in this minute? I'll worry about tomorrow. Right now, I just need to be able to get up on stage and do this thing, or walk into this room and do whatever, or sit at my desk and get this accomplished. But too often, either it comes at a cost, or there's no real thought down the road of, can we be improving things? Because we know that if, certainly when people are younger, they don't think about this so much. But as we age, we have to start thinking about, if we don't put the right things in place, if we don't play our cards right today, there's going to be a price to pay down the road. And so what can we do to both perform in this minute and shore up our performance and whatever else for the long term? And so with Qualia Mind, which is what we're obviously talking about. So when you say they're slow acting, like saffron, lutein, and zeaxanthin, when you're talking about them as slow acting, does that mean it's that the benefits build over time? Like you need time for them to really do their thing, whereas there's probably, which is the other benefit of stacking, you're going to be able to build other ingredients in there that are more fast acting, that are going to give you what you need today.
Absolutely. That's exactly what I mean by that. There's certain things like, caffeine, L-theanine would be examples of things that in most studies and in most people's personal experience, they would feel the day they take them, often within, like a half hour, 40 minutes. If we were mapping the brain, we would see changes in brain activity from those things. Ginkgo has classically been always something that's been most associated with memory. And memory is a long-term game. It's not like our memory doesn't improve in the way we're going to feel in a moment or a day. It's more changing the brain's landscape. And then the cholinergic system, as I mentioned, acetylcholine is really involved. And that's more like long-term. And the way memory works is, I use the word relevance because that would be a word that a lot of neuroscientists use. But I had mentioned the importance of focused attention. And that often, if we continually focus our attention on something, we can let the brain know, oh, this is important. I should get better at detecting this, right? That's the idea of relevance in a nutshell. And language is a good example. From 7th grade till the end of 12th grade in middle and high school in the US, I studied Spanish. And after my freshman year, so grade 9, before grade 10, I actually had an opportunity to live in Mexico with friends of my mom's. And so was more immersed in it that summer. So I was better at Spanish then than I was 3 years later, continuing to study it because it was more relevant.
Oh, yeah.
Summer, right? So language, if we're around a language all the time, our brain quickly learns like, oh, I better get better at this. Yeah. I'm an avid reader. I bet I probably read 50 novels a year if I have time, maybe not all novels, but, some, works related to the brain and, biohacking and other things. But a lot of novels in the year. And so my brain's learned like holding on to those stories and characters isn't particularly relevant because it's going to meet new ones next week.
Right.
So when I was young, one of the first novels I ever read was The Hobbit in 5th grade. Like I had a kind of like what I would describe now as like almost a hippie-ish teacher. She was really amazing, but she had us read that, which is a weird book for 5th graders. And I loved it. So I read The Lord of the Rings after. And I would still be able to remember more about that book, even if I'd never read it, than, a book I might have read last month, just because it was more relevant. And my brain at the time hung on to it. So relevance always matters, focus always matters, but then the resources provided by things like Qualia Mind, but especially the things that help more the long-term brain are important. But we need the short-term things so we can focus our attention, right? So
what are some of the short-term superheroes in Qualia Mind?
Okay, so so I think that stack of caffeine and theanine and in the right, general ratio. So to get the best out of that stack, you usually want about at least as much L-theanine as caffeine, preferably closer to twice as much. And we use that 2-to-1 ratio. So that's, like fairly magical, I think, for most people. And then I think like saffron I've talked about as a long-term nootropic, but for mood, saffron can be felt, often the day we take it or within a couple days. What we
so it's both short and long-term benefits.
Yeah. What we have a caffeine-free version of mine, which I know you're a fan of. I see you shaking your head.
Well, I'll sometimes go steal one with caffeine from someone. Like
And
I'll take a little bit of I think my threshold for the caffeine is maybe just a bit lower than most people.
okay, yeah, and mine I generally think of as lower. I do well with caffeine crunched early in my day and relatively poorly when it's later. And by poorly, for me, what shows up is, say, if I had a cappuccino or espresso at a like dinner because it was an Italian dinner and it feels like the great thing to have. Yeah, I'll struggle with falling asleep and I'll wake up a couple hours later or earlier than normal. So I get hit on both ends. But what we did in the caffeine-free version, since there was no caffeine, we used something called N-Extra, which is a clinically studied extract of galangal, which is a Thai spice. It's in the ginger family.
Delicious Thai spice, actually.
Yeah. And
I love galangal.
And that is also something. It's not stimulating like caffeine, but it's alertness enhancing in a focus manner quickly. So and that wasn't in our old caffeine-free version. So that would be what I think of as another upgrade. So those are a few things. One ingredient that I'm super excited to introduce to the world through the Qualia Mind is called Nootropic. And Nootrocog's new on the landscape of things that are nootropics. It's a combination of two things. Boswellia, which is often used for joint health, would be one of its common things, or GI health. And then Terminalia chibulia, which is from Ayurveda, and they would describe it as a rasayana, like a rejuvenator in a sense. And that combination, the reason it was so cool is to make the original Qualia Mind and to do this revised version, we have a database of about 120 nootropics that we've reviewed all the literature, written up summaries of it, think of like white papers. And at the end of the day, graded these things from a 1 to 5 as nootropics. 1 being like, LOL, I can't believe anyone in their right mind would pay any money for this. And 5 being like, oh, this is a star. Yeah. And the truth is a lot of nootropics end up 3-ish. So not nothing, but not.
Yeah, kind of in the middle. Yeah.
And anyways, Nootropic in its human study, I was given the study from the contract research organization to be able to look at the entire thing before it was published. And what was impressive, it was 3 months, which is long for a cognitive study. It did a lot with memory. It actually did a learning test, something called the RAISE audiovisual learning test, and it sped up the rate of learning. What's crazy common in nootropic studies is they'll do a battery of cognitive tests, some for attention, some for executive function, some for memory. And if something improves 1 or 2 of those, usually thumbs up, like, all right, like there's something here. What was really impressive about Nootropic is it improved a whole bunch of the things they looked at, that maybe the most I've ever seen in a study.
Really?
And then it just built over time. So 4 weeks was better than 2 weeks, and 8 weeks was better than 4, and 12 was better. So so I love that we're bringing that to people. But that would be not slow in the sense like lutein, that's over months, but something that was slower, kind of in between, not something felt in a day. Because again, learning and memory, those are things that upgrade.
Well, it takes time. Yeah. You got to lay down infrastructure.
Yeah.
So you're pulling so much from herbalism, you have a really interesting background in this stuff, right? Because you read the back of the bottle and there's not nearly as much, there's not really much in the way of chemical. Paracetam is a chemical. Yeah. It's a research compound. We've been talking about spices and herbs for the most part. We haven't even brought up any of the mushrooms, but I'm sure there's lion's. Is there? Yep. Did you keep lion's mane in?
We actually added it back in. It was in original Qualia, which you would have taken. We called that 2-step. It was 2 different bottles. And then it was something that had been removed to reduce capsule count when we did the original Qualia Mind. And over the years, it's been by far the biggest question that's come to me is why don't you use lion's mane? And it's we love lion's mane. But so, we reintroduced it. And one of the people... so one of the things at Qualia we do, we read the research, but then we also rely on what, I would describe as N of 1, individual experiences. And one of the people that I got on the phone was Ben Greenfield when we were, revising the Mind to Mind 2.0, and asked his thoughts about things like lutein, which he was a big fan of, but lion's mane at the time. And specifically, he liked an extract from a company called Namex. So that's what.
Yeah, those guys are great.
Yeah. So it's called real lion's mane, and it's an 8-to-1 extract. So really potent, fruiting bodies only. And that's now in Qualia Mind, the new version of Qualia Mind. And it's a great, like neuroplasticity type of support. That's the way I think about it. Other things we did that were more based on the N of 1 experiences of biohackers and nootropic experts was a stack of something called Subroxy. That's the brand name of it. And Polygala, which we had already been fans of and use in Qualia Night. And those Polygalas out of TCM, and is one of the 50 most prized herbs and has historically been used. So when you asked about the herbs and spices, think of those as the OG nootropics, right? Like traditional systems figured these out. And Polygala was often used for things like mental clarity. And Subroxy is from the Ayurvedic tradition. It's the bark of a specific tree. And looking at subreddits and talking to some of the cutting edge people, they started stacking those two things together with some of the other things that would be in Qualia Mind. And on their own, they were thought of as relatively weak nootropics, but they amplified the other things really effectively. So, those would be, again, in that more fast acting category. And it's, I think, one of the things that tends to make Qualia unique is that we actually read the studies, which is rare. When I meet with, suppliers of some of the ingredients, they're like, oh, you seem like to be the only one that asks questions about our studies. And, but then we also don't disregard N of 1 because, that your mileage may vary. Sometimes things in a study aren't going to show up that would be really important in a product that we're making. And then the last part, I think, is that we actually studied the new version of Qualia Mind and put it kind of through the ropes. So we did a 3-arm study. So for listeners, what that means is we made up enough prototypes for what's now Qualia Mind. We compared that with another group of people taking original Qualia Mind, and then we made up a somewhat different formula to see, at the end of the day, like competition. And, the new version that I've been taking now since end of September outcompeted the other ones and was the clear winner. So, we pride ourselves on not just relying on the ingredient research and saying, oh, like these things look like they would work well together, or, this ingredient allows us to make a memory claim and this one attention claim, like we're good. We always, before we would ever sell a product, make sure that we've studied that exact recipe and that it did what we hoped it would do. And with Qualia Mind, it absolutely did. And I know I was a huge fan of original Qualia. I'm, equally as big fan of the original Qualia Mind and an even bigger fan of this new product. So for listeners, I would just say, again, pay attention to how you respond to whether it's Qualia Mind or any other nootropic. But we've gotten great feedback so far on the new version.
And so are people finding that it's lasting? For me, I find it takes me through the day. But is that a common thing? Or do people sometimes feel like they need a top up partway? Like thinking about a guy like your dad, right? Yeah. Like if we could go back in time and meet Mr. Kelly, Mr. Kelly Sr., and say, you know what, I got something that you can take with you on your way to work, and you're going to have a great, but is it enough to take him through the whole day? Or is there a use case scenario where you've got someone who's got such a long day? Like, just if you have a horrendous commute, like just the mental energy you use dealing with traffic and all the misery that is from getting from point A to point B, you're already kind of behind the 8 ball by the time you hit the office. And now you've got to perform and you've got all these demands put on you. And then you got to do it again.
Yeah. For listeners, there was 6 kids and my mom was, a stay-at-home homemaker, and often we would have driven her batty by the time my dad came in the door. So she'd have saved up a bunch of things for him that she did, had given up.
Yeah, no, it just sounds like chaos. Yeah, it's
yeah. So, like for listeners, the general recommendation, if you were to look on the bottle of Qualia Mind, would be 3 to 6 capsules a day. 6 would get you the studied amount of, the things like the Nutricog and the lutein branded one that we use. Some people will do fantastic on 2 or 3. Like for their normal day, that might be sufficient. And then maybe on a busy day, they're going. I just was at a trade show recently. Like a trade show day, I'm going to for sure do 6 because I'm in an environment that's a lot more draining than my normal, sitting in my lovely home looking out at the ocean part of the day and going for walks around the block every hour. But for me, most days I'll do 4 to 6 Qualia Mind. And for me, and the way I take Qualia Mind and that we generally recommend is 5 days on, 2 days off. It doesn't have to be exactly that, but we think of it like exercise. You don't want to do the same exercise every day. That just causes too much opportunity for adaptation. So like having breaks built in. And what I would notice personally, Qualia Mind fuels me completely through the day at somewhere in that 3 to 6 range. But
are you taking it all at once, or are you taking 3 and then 3 again?
I usually take it all at once, somewhere between first waking and about 9 a.m. is when I would. And
before food or with food? I'm just going to ask you these questions because people are going to ask me, and I know how I take it, but everybody's going to want to hear it out of you. So
I've done both. We're recording this now. We started around 10 a.m. my time. So around 9 this morning, I did, the 6 capsules of Qualia Mind with, a few eggs at that point in time. So that probably more commonly with food. It does have the full B complex, not crazy high amounts, but B complexes and some other things for some sensitive people are better tolerated with food. And there's no drawback to taking it with food. So that's often the easier way. If like I remember at one point we were at a Spartan event exhibiting there, and next to us was the U.S. Army recruiting booth set up, and they had a barbell with, I think, like total it was like 240 kilos of weight, including the barbell. And they had a competition across the day, like who could do the most deadlifts. And so they had like a big blackboard keeping track. And at some point, this, like 6'3", like not like a power lifter build, more like not a rock climber, like a big guy, but not crazy big, came by and he's like, I'm going to go for it. Can I grab a packet of Qualia Mind? So he, just did that with some water, walked around for like 20 minutes, came back, and then set the record at that point. It was like 43 or some crazy amount. And then by around 3 in the afternoon, someone else had beaten him out. It was like at 45. So he came back again and then did another Qualia Mind, walked around for a bit, and then jammed out like 52, which I can't even imagine the grip strength to hold it long enough.
Yeah.
Never mind that.
Never mind that your arm's not coming out of your shoulder sockets.
Yeah. So he was using it to kind of, like for sports performance, which was something we've seen a lot with Qualia Mind over the year, intentionally in advance to kind of go for a personal best. I mentioned, if I'm speaking at a conference or know I'm going to have a longer day, I'll definitely do the 6 capsules of Qualia Mind. I've not found personally I need more than this, but that person was a big guy and did 12 over the course of the day. Not something that I would generally recommend. But the key thing with any nootropic is always that your mileage may vary and paying attention to your own need. Like I've said, I've met people 1 or 2 capsules of Qualia Mind. They say, oh, this is, they would describe it as microdosing Qualia Mind. And that's perfect for them.
It's enough for them.
Yeah, I've met.
But I think you bring up a really interesting point about using a nootropic that we associate only with brain function for physical performance, because I think people really underestimate or undervalue. I don't know they underestimate it, but they undervalue the importance of this whole neural connection to muscles is to performance. Like if your nerves aren't firing fast enough, you can't recruit enough muscle fibers. You can't overcome, and actually this is another one, you can't overcome the one little voice that's going, are you crazy? Stop it. Put this down right now. Yeah. And the other voice that goes, we got this. We got this. You just go away, and being able to manage that inner dialogue, I think to your point, again, takes a massive amount of mental energy.
Yeah, and that's those executive functions, right? Like that negotiation between like willpower being depleted, sticking the course, things like that are executive functions, and those require a lot. And I know, one of the way I grade Qualia Mind and frankly all nootropics is, what happens post lunch? Do I feel that huge drop in energy, which if you do, that's fine. But I know on Qualia Mind, that's crazy unusual for me. Like I'm productive. If anything, I'm often my most productive from that early mid-afternoon through the end of the day. And, often find myself still motivated to do more work at 6 or 7 if I'm working on something I like. How we show up, as I mentioned, for the people important in our lives when we get home from work. That's even if we took a nootropic first thing in the morning, that's a sign that it's something that's really working for us, because that's a time when most of us are just going to be more depleted. And so those are the ways like I personally grade it. And for me, Qualia Mind excels in those 2 windows, which I think as important as is to get focused and motivated early in my day, that's not hard for me. Those things, I'm usually well rested. Those are pretty easy. It's then like, what's my capacity when resources would normally have been lower? And so that's the way I would, start to focus on it. And then, the other thing is you were talking about performance. And I want to say it was about 3.5 years ago, a journalist contacted Qualia and said, I'm writing an article. And the premise is that there's some exercises that benefit from focus and a whole bunch, of things from zoning out. And I'm like, LOL, there's none that benefit from zoning out.
Exactly.
Not if you're trying to improve better or get, there's, I think Ellen Langer is the name of the woman that's done a lot of research on mindset. And if people just think they're doing exercise and are focused on it, they get a much better response. So something like Qualia that helps with focus particularly, but also that sense of mental energy can be hugely important to get the best ROI from our exercise. And then kind of the last piece is, I'm sure some listeners exercise first thing in the morning. Over the years, I've gone back and forth, sometimes early in the day, sometimes at the end of the day. And I remember when I was, maybe it was my first year of working at Qualia, we were, we still had an office. We're a largely remote company now. And there'd be times at the end of the day driving home, it was maybe 25, 30 miles from where the office was to where I lived, that it would have been easy potentially to skip the gym. Long day, already commuted one way, commuted another, have more things coming home. And I know for many of us, it can be easier to bypass the good thing at the end of the day and go home. And that would be another test of a good supplement. Do we still have enough mental energy to do the hard thing when it's the right thing, even at the end of our day? And like in this case, going to the gym or doing something else that, is important for us to improve the overall landscape of our lives. So I think resources like Qualia Mind are indispensable for things like that.
Well, 100%. What about for someone like a student? We're talking about people who are 12-hour days don't cut it for them, right? They're like 8-hour days is laughable. They're in school. Then they got to come. Then they got whatever they've got after school. Then they come home. Then they sometimes have to study, do assignments. They have to keep performing. Is there a world where you might say, in that case, maybe you take your 6 Qualia Mind first thing in the morning before your day, but you keep a bottle of maybe the caffeine-free Qualia Mind on hand, and maybe use an extra couple of capsules as a top-up after dinner if you're going to be burning the midnight oil as it is.
Yeah, absolutely. I know some people that will split the dose when they're going to have long days and do some in the beginning, some more later. I even met one person, he used Qualia Mind before going out. I think he was a New Yorker and, wasn't normally a late night person, but on a few weekends through the month, would go out with friends and have a late night. And he relied on Qualia Mind to take then, like at dinner to get through to like 2, 3 or whatever crazy, time of the night he was staying up to. So yeah, like it's versatile. Like it's a nootropic that's intended to meet people's needs and where their life is. When I was in the Navy, before ever becoming a naturopath, I had a lot of shift work. So, at that point, I would not have used it the way I normally do now, because my routine is much more structured, where by then it was like constantly rotating, and I would have used, Qualia Mind at the time that made sense each day to get me through the demands of that.
To kind of overcome your circadian needs, which is an interesting concept for anybody listening who does shift work, where you might be able to use something like this to help you on those shifts when your body really wants to shut down, to kind of overcome that desire, that legit desire to shut it down. Now, there's probably, I think one of the things that we're seeing a lot of is kids who are struggling with focus and concentration and honestly with mental energy. So if there's parents listening to this, how young would you say? I mean, I don't think you've studied it in children, but on the one hand, I'm looking at the ingredients going, well, it's a bunch of herbs and spices, but it's a lot more than, it's very potent. So is it something that someone could use like with a high schooler? Is there a cutoff age that you would use it at, and definitely probably lower dose for smaller people?
Yeah, so we generally just recommend Qualia Mind for adults, and we just do that conservatively, in part because some of the compounds, like the botanicals, extracts in it, haven't been studied in kids. And so just as to be conservative, that's our recommendation. I do know practitioners that work a lot with teenagers and have used Qualia Mind as a staple product. And in that context, that's usually been teenagers. I always would recommend anything for a teen, start at the lowest amount possible, give that a trial, and then, if you need to slowly titrate up. And then for like younger than teen, a 5 to 12, I would stick more with something like lutein and zeaxanthin. That's been
like single ingredient stuff.
Or omega-3s would be another. So Qualia Mind wouldn't be a go-to for me, just because even fewer of the things would have had a long study and developed in the brain. Sense. Where something like lutein, I'm aware of a 6-month study in that.
And they studied on kids.
Yeah. Right. Saffron, I've seen studies on, younger than teens, as well as teens. So there's individual things I would start with first there if I was, advising a parent what to do.
Yeah, and as a parent, if you're inclined to do research, that's a really good thing, right? Take a look at the compound you're looking at and see, has it been studied in children before you're giving it to your child. Now, okay, so my last big question of the day is, I hear that Qualia Mind's been featured in a study of its own. I mean, we've talked about lots of other studies during this episode, studies of ingredients, studies done on people and this and that, but Qualia Mind itself popped up in a study recently, yes?
Yeah, so there's a naturopathic doctor in San Diego area named Heather Sanderson that both has a practice and then also has a medical home. And the medical home is focused on people with age-related cognitive decline, so memories issues with age. And a couple of years back, she filed an IRB and then did a study based on the Brednison protocol, which I know you'd be familiar with, but it's a pretty comprehensive approach, including things like detoxification and diet and working on sleep and exercise. And in that study, she used several different supplements, but she used Qualia Mind as the way she would describe it, as the multi-nutrient for her clients in that study. And the study in total, Qualia Mind just being one piece of the puzzle, along with the diet and lifestyle, actually reversed the assessment they do. It's called a MOCA scale. So usually lower numbers are worse. Like you want your MOCA score to be higher, and it went up by a couple years in the people in her study. So it got a
Wow.
lot of attention. She eventually published a book, based on, her work. So,
Well,
and
congratulations.
it was lovely
That's
that
a big
Qualia
deal.
Mind was a part of it. And, Heather, the Qualia podcast has always been called Collective Insights. And, if you go back in the archives, Heather was for a long time, she was the host of Collective Insights. And so she's,
Wow.
she's to date still my favorite host we've ever had, because she was just such a lovely personality and asked the best questions of our guests.
And takes her Qualia Mind.
She's been a really a great Qualia supporter. One of our founders is named Daniel Smachtenberger, and she studied under Daniel at one point after getting her naturopathic license to learn his approach to complex health problems. So she's always been a wonderful supporter of our company.
Well, you're doing, it's survived through the ages. I don't know how long I've been using Qualia Mind, but it's been a few years now. And given what I do, I get sent a lot of stuff, and there are not many things. I don't know that there's anything that's as consistent, kind of steady Eddie. If I really need to get something done, I can just go to my Qualia Mind, and I know that I'm going to benefit from it. So it's a favorite stack, and it's a great, I think it's something that anybody really should try. Because, there's always the odd person that, for whatever reason, may not respond the same way as everybody else. But I think in general, it tends to be a crowd pleaser. Is that what you've seen?
Yeah. And we actually originally met talking about Qualia Mind. Qualia was it was a biohacker event sponsored by the folks out of Finland back in Toronto in 2018.
Oh my God, that's right.
And you came by because you had been taking it, and you wanted to ask questions about giving it to your son at the time.
Who didn't really need it, if I really think about it. Now that he's in law school, he could always use a little extra mental energy.
Yeah, and that's how we met originally. Yeah. Was over that, and at the time we were just had launched what's now called Qualia Mitochondria Plus, and we talked about that at the time as well. So, yep.
And now there's Qualia Senolytic. There's all the Qualia family. It's all amazing, amazing products, and a lot of it has to do. Well, so much of it has to do with the way that you put things together, right? So the last question is, how do you determine safety when you're taking as many ingredients as you're taking in one of these formulas like Qualia Mind? Like, how do you decide what to put together? Like, it's like you're a master chef or an alchemist or something. Like, how do you figure that out and make sure that things aren't going to fight with each other?
Yeah. So I think, some of that is, being diligent and, turning over every stone, so to speak, right? Research, traditional use, N of 1 experiences. And then, like I said, we always do our own safety, tolerability, and efficacy study on the whole recipe, which is, it seems crazy, but that's like so unique in the industry. I was just got an email from, really famous brand, and they were in it linked to an article where they were talking about, how they rely on the ingredient studies supplied, to do things. And it's like, that may be great for an ingredient, but for a blend of ingredients, it's, things don't always add up the way we think they might.
Yeah. Well, it's like yeah.
I think you had asked one other thing which was, generally speaking, do most people perform well to Qualia Mind? And I was, I won't share his name because he hasn't given me permission, but someone that pretty well known in the biohacker space, loved original Qualia, which the original Qualia had some things in it that we stopped using because they're not really dietary supplements. And as Qualia grew, we, at the time we got smarter, like, oh, we probably shouldn't use this thing. And then Qualia Mind, he didn't do great on. It just didn't perform as well for him.
The new ones.
No, this would have been the original Qualia Mind.
Oh, I see.
And but I've been talking to him recently, and he's just loving this Qualia Mind. So I've heard more of that than any other piece with the new is this, the subset of people that the original Qualia Mind didn't quite work well for have, very consistently now shared with me that this new one is something that reminds them of the original Qualia in terms of
Nice.
reliability for them. So, I'm super pleased to hear that, obviously.
For sure. Well, I mean, folks, by now you're probably curious. I don't know. If I was listening, I would be. If you've made it this far, and you want to get your hands on some Qualia, the new Qualia Mind, like, so even if you've tried it before and you've found, and the beauty of your company is if it really doesn't work for someone, they can contact you, and you're not in the business of just sloughing things off on people. But you can go to qualialife.com/longevity. Is that it?
Mm-hmm.
qualialife.com/longevity. And you'll get a great deal, but you can get a chance to try the new Qualia Mind and see how it works for you. Is there anything we left out?
No, I mean, we've covered a lot. So I would just say, in addition to nootropics like Qualia Mind, a few other things, to think of if you want to get your, like your focus ability is, one is called attention restoration. It's pretty simple. Like I'm watching now you, and there's a lovely green tree background, but we've talked a lot about depleting mental energy. No matter, how laser focused we are, our brain needs periodic breaks to shuffle resources around. And one of the best ones is just going outside for a walk, especially in nature, if we have access to it, or watching clouds, or looking at fish in a fish tank, something that would be a natural thing where our brain doesn't have to use a lot of resources. So, that can be a super important hack to add in multiple points in your day to make sure that your brain gets to like recharge, restore, and fire on all cylinders before being tapped out.
Yeah, that's a great piece of advice, getting out of nature. Well, actually, so let's make our parting gift to the audience. What's Dr. Kelly's top 5 things you do, quite apart from taking Qualia Mind? What are the 5 things people want to make sure they do to ensure that they're going to have that cognitive energy to get through their day and show up in the way that they want to in whatever situation it is, whether it's at the gym, at the office, at home, or all 3?
Yeah, so one would be that idea of doing things to intentionally allow our attentional system to restore itself multiple times during the day. And during those breaks, we don't want to do the same thing we've been doing during our focus time period. So, I'm on a computer a lot reading things. A break, for my brain wouldn't be then taking my phone and scrolling something on my phone, right? That's going to use the same parts of my brain. So we want something that's going to restore our attention, which means something completely different for our brain that would be forcing it to use. And often just letting our mind wander during that is the best. I begin and most days listening to some type of music intentionally. So I think Spotify would call it shamanic music, but it could be like yoga type of like chants or other ceremonial type of music. And it doesn't even have to have lyrics. And when I listened to it, we talked a little bit about that raw emotional experience, the bottom up brain. I focus on just like letting my attention wander to wherever in my body something may be stored and want to bubble up. And then I don't try to do anything other than just pay attention to it. And I think, like if a baby was crying, in general, a responsible adult would soothe it and pay attention. And paying attention is always the gateway. So, often just paying attention to sensations in my body is sufficient that they kind of just bubble up and go their own little way.
And resolve.
Yeah. So I begin and end most days with that as instead of a more classical meditation. But meditation.
So that's your kind of form of meditation.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. Just I think of it as like an interoception meditation. I'm just trying to pay attention to sensations and emotions may be stored in my body. I think sleep clearly, right? And a key thing about sleep a good friend, actually in Kelowna, Canada, I had mentioned I was up visiting, has spent a lot of time on, he's developing an app to help people. But, we were talking about his sleep, and I'm like, you're missing the most obvious thing. Like, did you go to bed by 10, and did you go to bed roughly the same time every night? Because there's certain things that we do a lot better when they're predictable. And that when we eat meals and when we go to sleep and wake up would be those things. Other things like variety is the spice of life, but not with those two things. So that would be a third, like,
regular
go to bed at a reasonable time, and then whatever that time is, be predictable as often as possible. And then I'm a big fan of like an exercise portfolio. So strength, movement, balance, whatever that happens to mean, there's lots of ways to go about all of those. And then maybe the single most important that at least I would view in my, many decades now of working in health is pay really good attention to the stories you tell about yourself and about others, and work on becoming a better storyteller. And if that's all you did, your health would be improved by it. So,
nice.
So that I pay a lot of attention to that. And
so that you're talking about the inner voice, like that inner conversation that you're having, or are you?
It's just like a story. So like my story about my dad growing up was like, oh, my dad's never watched me play hockey or gone to a baseball game. Like, what a crappy dad I have. Like, why can't he be like the good dad? Right. Where now my story is like, oh, like, wow, that like my dad sacrificed so much to give me an opportunity to play hockey. Right. Like, that's just a story. His behavior didn't change in either case. My story, I think, is a more generous one that serves his memory better and serves me better. And there's relatively little in each of our lives is based exclusively on what's actually real, like that our senses would be detecting. Most of it's the story we're telling ourselves about those things, and so what's amazing is I still periodically catch myself telling stories that they're like, oh, like, why am I still telling that story? It's definitely, it's not serving the result I want. So
that's very powerful.
So
reframing those stories.
Yeah. And just being aware that, we are all storytellers, and are we telling a story that would be the best one possible under the circumstances? And quite often, and like I said, I'm as guilty as, other humans. We aren't. And often the quickest upgrade in our life is realizing that that's just a story and figuring out a better one to tell ourselves.
I love it. So number 1 was brain breaks, get it in nature. Number 2 was shamanic music, AM, PM, or whatever serves you, whether it's breath work, meditation, that's what works for you. Number 3 was sleep, of course. Number 4 was, what did you say? Exercise portfolio, which I love, because that means that saves us from, it basically says there's got to be variety in there. And number 5 was those stories, the stories that you tell yourself or even tell to the world, and how you frame the events of your life. I love that.
Like
Thank you.
I was, for listeners, I got to be on stage with Deepak Chopra in December at a live event in Miami.
Wow.
And, I was walking, through the audience to get up on stage, and it occurred to me that I felt like I deserved to be up there. Not that I'm have done as much, in terms of contribution necessarily as him with all his books and other things, but that my sense was, Greg, maybe even when we first met in 2018, had I been offered that, I would have felt overawed and like, oh, I don't deserve to be up there. And that part's all the story part. But the truth was I was going to be up there one way or another. The story attached to that was maybe not in my, wouldn't have been as consciously in my awareness. And then my story was supportive of me being, I should be up here next to him. And there are things I can contribute to the listeners in this audience. So that's the story piece, right? That's always something we can control. I know someone else, allowed me to be up there, but then how I'm up there is my call.
Love it. You most definitely deserve to be up there. You've helped a lot of people, Greg. You do it every day. So thank you for everything that you do. Thank you for taking the time to be here. Once again, guys, if you want to give Qualia Mind a try, just go to qualiamind.com/longevity. Thank you. Have a good night. I'll see you soon. I hope.
Yeah, I hope too.